If you like explainers like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel as well as checking out our sister channels, including TLDR EU, which is naturally always explaining political groupings and relationships just like this video. It's linked down below. Anyway, let's get straight into it. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, is an economic union between 10 Southeast Asian countries. They are, in alphabetical order, Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand and Vietnam. ASEAN was preceded by the Association of Southeast Asia, otherwise known as ASA, which was a smaller union between Thailand, the Philippines and Malaya, which in 1963 would become integrated into Malaysia. ASA was founded in 1961 with the purpose of creating peace and ensuring regional stability. At the time, many countries in Southeast Asia were struggling to contain national communist influences. The Filipino government was struggling with the communist Huk Balahap, the Indonesian government was struggling with the Indonesian Communist Party, and Malaysia was struggling with the Sarawak communist insurgency. And they decided that they stood a better chance of ensuring stability if they cooperated with one another. ASA eventually collapsed in 1963 after Malaysia claimed Sabah as part of Malaysia in the Malaysia Agreement, before being replaced by Mafalindo, which was composed of Malaysia, the Philippines and Indonesia. Again, Mafalindo didn't really last, largely because each country emphasised its own national interest, and the plan sort of petered out by 1965. Despite these two previous failures, in 1967 representatives from 5 Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines and Singapore, met in Bangkok to discuss a Southeast Asian Union, where they signed the Declaration of Bangkok on August the 8th, creating ASEAN. Now, originally ASEAN's objectives were pretty vague. It was about encouraging economic cooperation and promoting regional peace and security, but there wasn't anything particularly substantial, no single market or any sort of military alliance. Not much happened for the first 10 years or so, in part thanks to a confusing and overlapping committee structure and the fact that countries only met once a year, but mainly because there were mutual suspicion between various member states. The Philippines was still unhappy about Sabah. Malaysia was supporting Muslim separationists in Thailand, while Thailand was providing refuge for Malaysian Communist Party insurgents, and there were suspicions that Singapore, which was at the time 75% ethnically Chinese, would turn into a third China, supporting communist insurgencies in the region. Nonetheless, ASEAN held together because, whatever suspicions they had against one another, the ASEAN countries were more worried about the rise of communist insurgencies in the region, especially Vietnam. These anxieties were exacerbated by the then popular domino theory of communist geopolitics, which implied that the successful communist takeover of Vietnam would guarantee a similar fate for other countries in the region. And while ASEAN didn't have any real powers, it did help its member states overcome their various disagreements and avoid outright conflict with one another. Given that the rest of Southeast Asia was in almost constant political turmoil, the region is sometimes described as the Balkans of the East, this was a real achievement. Anyway, you get the point. For the first 10 years or so, ASEAN did a pretty good job of ensuring regional stability, even if it didn't make any formal changes to its members' relations. Nonetheless, after the rise of the communist Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and the fall of Saigon in 1975, its members decided that ASEAN could do with a revamp. At the Bali conference in 1976, ASEAN revamped its committee structure and, more importantly, signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, otherwise known as the TAC. The TAC had 3 important components. First, it included the proviso that the treaty shall be open for accession by other states in Southeast Asia, which eventually led to the integration of Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar and Vietnam. Second, it established a ministerial-level High Council for dispute settlements, and third, it expanded ASEAN to include cooperation on matters of national resilience, which was a sort of diplomatic euphemism for security matters. There was also a plan for a free trade area, but nothing really came of it. Anyway, over the next few years, ASEAN member states, unlike their regional neighbours, enjoyed relative political stability, and ASEAN became the region's leading voice on trade and security issues. Political stability enabled sustained economic prosperity, and according to the World Bank data, from 1976 until 1982, the cumulative GDP of ASEAN member states went from $91.1 billion to $211.9 billion, amounting to a seriously impressive average annual growth of 15%. Unsurprisingly, ASEAN became the coolest club in Southeast Asia, and in the 80s, its membership started expanding. In 1984, after gaining independence from the United Kingdom, Brunei became ASEAN's 6th member. In 1992, convinced by the merits of a free market economy, the ASEAN member states signed the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as AFTA, which involved the elimination of internal tariffs between ASEAN members, but importantly, no common external tariff, which meant that ASEAN member states could set whatever tariffs they want for non-ASEAN imports. In 1995, after the Cold War and a national transition from a planned economy to what was then known as a mixed economy, Vietnam joined the group, followed quickly by Laos and Myanmar in 1997 and Cambodia in 1999. In 2007, ASEAN member states signed the ASEAN Charter with the aim of creating a single market for the region's 615 million or so people, which would be the world's largest. Nonetheless, ASEAN was still relatively toothless, and it did have a firm policy of non-interference, which essentially meant that it couldn't get involved in member states' internal affairs. Interestingly, this policy has been challenged recently by the ongoing genocide of Rohingya Muslims and the military coup in Myanmar. You can't really have a policy of non-interference when one of your member states is committing genocide and oppressing its people, because, well, it looks weak, which is why in October 2021, for the first time, ASEAN disinvited one of its member states by refusing to involve Myanmar in its annual summit. While this might not sound like much, it has seriously undermined the legitimacy of Myanmar's military junta, and in the eyes of the international community, and it marks a turning point in ASEAN's neutral, non-interference policy. So that's a quick TLDR history of ASEAN. All in all, ASEAN is interesting because it doesn't really have any legal powers. It's essentially just a forum for Southeast Asian countries. Nonetheless, ASEAN has political weight, and that matters. Despite its limited legal powers, ASEAN has successfully maintained relative peace amongst its member states for an impressively long time, and might be able to stop the chaos in Myanmar sometime soon. However, ASEAN is currently at a crossroads. It has to decide whether it wants to stick with the tried and tested non-interference policy and stand by while the military junta tightens its grip on power, or scrap the non-interference policy and intervene more heavily in Myanmar, even if that entails more responsibilities and difficult conversations about the relation between ASEAN and national governments. Anyway, what do you think? Should ASEAN do more, or is that a problem for Myanmar and Myanmar alone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Anyway, as always, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible, and if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then sign up by clicking the link below.